I think one thing that's very interesting about this discussion about New Zealand and Australia as part of the Five Eyes, the security alliance between the U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
Intelligence alliance,
yeah. Is how Australia and New Zealand have responded to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party is very different.
Yeah.
But how is that playing? Because in the case of Daniel Sudani, neither did very well.
Yes. But there's hope on the Australian side. So in a lot of countries, when you're dealing with China, you tend to have the defense intelligence and security community that's very concerned about China, and the political and economic community that's like, let's make money. And
the Wall Streets, the City of London.
Yeah. And through those campaign donations affecting the political scene. Okay? So, and this was very much the case in Australia. This is why the Port of Darwin, was leased to Landbridge. But then a whole bunch of coverage started to come out in the Australian press about these like dodgy deals. And it was a very interesting case of the intelligence community and the media working together to try to clean up their own system. And it's had some effect. That never happened in New Zealand. It hasn't happened in Canada either. I'm not just...
We'll get to the Canadians.
So there's kind of hope for Australia. And this is why when you're talking about the Pacific Islands, if you're in DC, you're talking about the Pacific Islands, and they talk about our allies in the region, they talk about Australia and New Zealand as if they're hyphenated, right? So we'll talk to the Australian New Zealanders, like it's kind of one sentence. And I'm starting to think that it might start to make sense to disaggregate them. Like, I think there's some situations where it's not helpful to have a New Zealander in the room. What I'm saying now would give heart attacks to a lot of different people in a lot of different locations. But I'm...
Which people?
So,
I mean, you don't have to name names, but like who would be like so upset about you don't want a New Zealander in the room?
Well, New Zealanders,
but I mean,
yeah. But you'd be surprised.
But the sheep will be happy.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I mean, even in Canada, so I talked to people in our got briefed our equivalent of State Department about these issues. And have said, it helps our overall security, including the security of Australia and New Zealand, if we take this more seriously and maybe don't kowtow quite so much to China and give people like Daniel Sudani a bit more leeway. And the Canadians will say, we can't defend the Australians and New Zealanders. And I'm saying, maybe we can offend the New Zealanders. Right?
I think it's always okay to offend New Zealanders, but also this is similar to our experience because in the spring of 2018, well, the fall down there, we went to Australia and then to New Zealand, and we had very different experiences. For example, like there were a lot of people we talked with in Australia, including a few people in government.
I was invited to speak at a prestigious Australian think tank.
Yeah, and you interviewed someone from the Liberal Party, which is their conservative people, and then you interviewed someone from the Greens, which was in a local David Shoebridge, and like you had this kind of across the political spectrum, these people who were like, okay, we really got to stand up to China, and they're in government, right? In New Zealand, as the producer, I'd spent a lot of time trying to reach out to get someone. It's like one person in government. Okay, if not someone in government, maybe at least some like journalist or like think tank person, and crickets.
We talked to a dairy farmer in New Zealand, though. Yes. That was the only person we could get to talk about China, which was fantastic. He was a great guy.
And the milk. Oh, that was great.
Yeah. We digress.
But the point is that like New Zealand politically and media-wise, we felt a very different atmosphere in regards to talking.
And this was even before the big shift in Australia about China. It was just beginning.
It was there. It was definitely there.
Yeah, but it wasn't what it was.
We went to Clive Hamilton's book launch. Right?
But this was still before they were like, oh, we probably shouldn't allow foreigners to contribute to politicians.
It was before they had actually passed the law, but they were already talking about it. So it was definitely in progress. In New Zealand, there were definitely people who were concerned about what's happening with China, but they were also concerned about being on camera talking about that.
Yeah, a lot of real estate problems in New Zealand, too. But I know I've heard people say that maybe New Zealand shouldn't be in the Five Eyes at all.
So that's been discussed. There are logistical reasons why they are in terms of kind of the locations of installations.
I mean, that's where Mordor is. We have to have somebody there.
Yeah. But I mean, if you were reconstructing the Five Eyes now, you might be looking more to Japan or, something like that.
I've heard some people are suggesting, hey, maybe Japan could be a replacement.
Yeah. And
which China. Woo.
And this is the thing. So there are two elements to it. One is, if we're disaggregating Australia and New Zealand, then what we might want to do in terms of effective outreach to the Pacific Islands to give them more alternatives to China, make that a quad project. Right? So then you can bring in some of those other elements from India and from Japan, and you still have Australia. So you're not necessarily insulting the New Zealanders. You're just saying, we're going to go with the quad on this one. We can plus with you on some projects, but, this is going to be...
Yeah, it's very interesting. The quad, it leaves out New Zealand. Australia's there. Australia, Japan, India, the U.S.
So what is, how does New Zealand see this? Do they want to continue having this influence over the Pacific Islands? How does Australia and New Zealand see their role there?
See, you didn't disaggregate.
Well, I mean,
you see how automatic it is?
I want to know both.
Okay,
because
okay.
I think how the Pacific Islands also see both of these countries and how they're, I feel like it might be different, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a great question. So I'll tell you what. So this is what I think. I know you don't think there's a political correctness in the context of talking about New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, but there is. So this is, this again is not going to get me invited to a lot of lunches in Wellington. But what I think, and this comes from their literature, is they were perfectly happy to blow up the Pacific Island Forum. Now, the Pacific Island Forum was a grouping of 18 countries in the Pacific, which included Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia. The Micronesian ones are kind of more associated with the U.S. And there was this just happened last year, there was a vote for the president of the Pacific Island, for the head of the Pacific Island Forum. And the Micronesians put forward a very good candidate, Gerald Zakios, who had been ambassador to the U.S. and who came from a country that recognized Taiwan, Marshall Islands. So the New Zealanders and Australians wanted Henry Puna, who came from the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands is part of the realm of New Zealand. I mean, that's the term for it, right? It's an sort of independent country, but sort of affiliated to New Zealand, like the freely associated states. And it came down to a vote, and there was a 1-vote difference, and Puna won. And 3 countries made that 1 vote possible: Australia, New Zealand, and France. France via New Caledonia. Okay?
The French.
Yeah. And the Micronesians had said, if you don't, it's our turn. We feel very marginalized in this organization. If our candidate can't be president, or head of it, then there's no reason for us to be a part of it anymore, and we will leave. And so Puna came in, and they've been leaving. 4 of the 5 have put in their papers to leave the Pacific Island Forum. Okay. Now, I think that was one of 2 things. That was either one, extremely bad intelligence on the part of Australia and New Zealand, or they're perfectly happy to cut off the U.S. part of the Pacific and consolidate their influence in an area where they have already more influence from their perspective, which is Melanesia and Polynesia, and in the context of New Zealand, it's Polynesia. And the language around the speech that the New Zealand foreign minister gave, there was that Five Eyes related speech that sort of raised a lot of hackles. But the language implies to me that they see New Zealand as the leader of Polynesia. And Polynesia goes from New Zealand up to Hawaii. It's a very big strategic stretch, a lot of different countries. And as the entry point for China into Polynesia. So they want, and they've said this overtly, defense or security and economic integration with Pacific Island countries, specifically Polynesia. So if the Chinese want access into that area, they would do it through base in New Zealand.
So for the bigger context, for people who might not quite understand this is basically because of China's influence on New Zealand and New Zealand's influence over all these Polynesian nations. This is China's foothold into controlling a huge part of the Pacific and really up to the U.S.'s doorstep at Hawaii.
I think that's how China sees it, and in fact, it's detailed in a book by Jian Yang, who became a member of the New Zealand Parliament after having taught for 10 years at a spy school in China. If you remember, do you remember that case?
Yeah, I
Do
do.
you remember the episode that we actually did on that? Well, I do.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
but
yes.
I listened to your
yes.
episodes. They're pretty good. You should. I recommend them.
Maybe I'll check it out.
Okay.
So what's interesting is strategically, like, China is kind of blocked in case of war from the Pacific by the first island chain, which is like Japan, which has islands that go all the way down almost to Taiwan, like Okinawa. And then you have Taiwan and you have the Philippines. And these countries are the first island chain from China's perspective that block its military from accessing the Pacific. But if China can build military bases in Polynesia, then China has now just completely sidestepped that entire first island chain that blocks China's navy. So now China's navy in peacetime can send a lot of navy and station them in the Pacific.
And then Japan is in a pincer attack instead.
Right.
Fishing boats, not navy.
Oh,
right.
Maritime militia.
That's right.
Yeah, this is so interesting to me because, like, no one has heard of the Pacific Island Forum. Nobody has any idea.
I mean, you're talking about Americans.
I'm sure probably more than just Americans have never heard of that. Like, if we went to the streets of Canada and said, "Hey, what do you think of the Pacific Island Forum?" What do you think the response would be?
It's a great restaurant. I can't get a table there. The sushi is delicious.
Well, but so these places that we like don't even think of in the Indo-Pacific are so critical for like the entire future of the world. Like, this is where the battle lines are being drawn between China and democracy, essentially.
It's so interesting watching that happen because it's kind of like how they blew up ASEAN in a lot of ways. I mean, ASEAN still exists, but they kind of...
By they, you mean the Communist Party.
China basically went in and managed to split it up, right, according to whichever countries they could get to align on their interests. And then the whole forum is kind of more or less crippled when it comes to dealing with China because they already have so much...
One of the French diplomats called it multi-bilateralism.
Yeah, that's really good. So explain that for the audience.
So it's supposed to be a multilateral institution where everybody's speaking to each other, but China views it more as a hub and spokes thing where China's talking to each of the other ones, and then sort of they're the center of it, and it's actually how they deal with the European Union. If you want to disable the European Union, then you pick a Greece or whatever, and you disable it that way. So you've got those bilateral relationships that infect and disable a multilateral forum. Yeah, and back to your island chain thing. So that first island chain concept is why Taiwan is so important to China. So they'll talk about reunification, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff, but it's strategic, right? It's they need that permanent physical location. It blows a hole in the first island chain. But like you said, if you move out to the second island chain or third island chain, which are these islands that we're talking about now, you can come at it from multiple sides. So when you're doing the scenarios, the war games around Taiwan, you're normally talking about the beaches on the west coast that face the Chinese coast. Mm-hmm. You're not talking about what happens when they come in from all sides. And the model, the Chinese PLA learns not just from other military conquests, but from other military defeats. And they've looked very closely at what happened with Japan during World War II. So these islands that we're talking about now, they're all islands that saw heavy conflict in World War II. If you look at the extent of the Japanese expansion during World War II, they encompass all of these islands. They encompass, sections of Kiribati and sections of Solomons and all those, all of those Palau, like all of those islands as well. They're trying to do what Kerry Grushanek, who's been on your show, has talked about in terms of winning without fighting. So when they knock down Daniel Sudani in the Solomon Islands and ensure that it is a proxy state, they have won the Solomons without fighting. And with our complicity, because we didn't stand up for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, first they came for the Solomon Islands, but I didn't speak up. I'm not from the Solomon Islands, and really, who cares at this point?
Well,
that's exactly it, actually.
And I think we were talking before the podcast about how a lot of people don't understand how many, islands in there are U.S. interests, right?
Yeah.
In that area of the Pacific.
Not just U.S. interests, actually U.S. So Guam is the west coast of the U.S. Those are American citizens on American soil.
Which the People's Liberation Army has made videos about bombing.
Right, but I mean, we'll put up a map on screen so people can see just how close to China Guam is.
Yeah.
And it's so far west, it's actually east. It's the easternmost part of the United States, according to the International Dateline.
And I think what's really dangerous about this is, so many Americans are used to thinking of the U.S. as superpower. We have the deterrence capability, but right under our noses, we're losing our international power. And if that happens, when it comes to China being all right, we're ready to fight, we might suddenly find we don't have all the cards we thought we did.
Yeah, we don't have. I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like if they're playing with those ninja cards that you kind of could throw and cut people to death with, right? And we're playing fish. It's more like that. We're not even doing what we should be doing with the cards. Right. So we have cards. We have, Grant Newsham, who's also been on your show, has talked about, we have the U.S. has the global reserve currency. We have global banking systems. We have a lot of economic levers that we're not using. So we have cards, but it comes down to political will. And I'd say to an understanding, as you're saying, where is the front line? It's not in the Atlantic. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think this is, you say the political will. The political will is driven by what the population thinks. And if the population doesn't know what, okay, we're not quite in our totalitarian hellscape yet. I think if the American people and other Western democracies are aware of the Pacific Island Forum and the importance of these countries, then that might push politicians' hands, but I can see how the U.S. is giving millions of dollars to Kiribati. Why should someone care about that in the U.S.? Why?
Well, you can if you want, and this is again the difference between Australia and New Zealand. You can tell that story. The Australian media told the story of Daniel Sudani, which lets the population know what's at stake, which gives the political support for those decisions. Or you can kill the story and not have to make that decision. So it's if you're looking at the Daniel Sudani case, mercifully he's okay. His health is okay. But there were a lot of people in Western capitals who would have been perfectly happy if he died. Right? That Wellington would have been very happy if this problem just went away. That's how far off base we've gone. When you've got an honest, hardworking, democratically elected leader and you want him dead because it's more convenient for you, you should probably rethink, what you're doing as a nation.
Well, and Sudani is not out of hot water yet. There's some rumors that once he goes back to the Solomon Islands, he might be put in prison for treason.
Yes, and this raises another issue because Solomon Islands has a history of civil wars, and the Australians led a kind of peacekeeping force there called Ramsey relatively recently. And if he goes back, he's very popular, and he's arrested for treason, there is a chance that the civil war might reignite. And if it reignites, the central government is, at this point, more likely to invite in Chinese peacekeepers than Australian peacekeepers. And this is something that the Chinese have been positioning themselves for a while. They've been doing peacekeeper operations in Africa. They say HADR is going to be part of their kind of remit going forward, is one of the justifications for such a big navy floating around the Pacific. So it's not, all of the pieces are in place for that to happen. But there's a lack of understanding of how far this has gone already and how quickly this could tip over, that we're not dealing with it when it's relatively low cost.
Well, do you see a scenario where you have Chinese troops supporting one side of the Solomon Island Civil War and Australian troops supporting the other side?
No.
So you think just Australia would not get involved at all?
The cost, at that point, the cost becomes very, very high for Australia. And it's easier for them to say, we're gonna work with them on this, and like the climate negotiation type stuff, global cooperation. And isn't it nice that the Chinese are stepping up and taking up their responsibilities as an international
stakeholder? So it'd be sold as like a great thing.
Well, what's the alternative?
Well, Australia doesn't want to start a war with China, right?
Well, that's the alternative. Right?
No, the war is coming. It's just...
I mean, I don't know whether you've seen that graphic of somebody put out on Twitter, some Chinese guy put out on Twitter, the entire Chinese Navy, all of the boats, the official boats, not even the maritime militia, arrayed against the Australian Navy. So you can find that graphic. It's like 4 rows of huge, massive ships and aircraft carrier, whatnot, and then like the little Australian Navy. And it's that kind of psychological warfare, one of the 3 warfares, right? That plays into the unrestricted warfare, that plays into pushing comprehensive national power, that makes it seem like it's a good idea to let Daniel Soudani die.
That it's just impossible to beat the Chinese Communist Party.
That's what they want you to think, but it's totally not. We have all these cards, but the starting point has to be to want to do it.
Political will, which means people need to pay attention and say something.